evening, everyone. Welcome to Kangan Taste, and welcome to the Feather Cedar Hall, and welcome to our, it's not an annual Arthur Calwell Memorial Lecture, it actually takes place once a term, and I'm very pleased today that we are back here in Broadmeadows. Our very first inaugural lecture, Arthur Calwell Lecture, was actually at the Global Learning Centre just behind here in Broadmeadows. Then we moved to Sunbury, and then to Sunshine, and then to Keilor, and now back here in Broadmeadows. So I'm particularly pleased, and I'm also very happy with the Australian Electoral Commission's rewriting of the boundaries. I don't have any complaints. It's nice to be able to bring the office back to Broady at the next federal election. I'd like to... What was that?
We like to Keilor.
I've got to be careful because of my Keilor Taylor's late people. But I did make the effort, Drago. It'd be lovely. You're always welcome. Can I start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people and paying my respects rather to elders past and present. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. Mary Elizabeth Hall, welcome. I think you'll probably... Should we make Mary Elizabeth the star of the show this evening? Although Luke Hilakari. And of course Luke Hilakari, who used to live here. Is that right?
Yeah, my grandparents lived there up in, anyone know Elizabeth Street, West Meadows?
Yes. There you go.
I live up there.
West Meadows. Roots in West Meadows, terrific. So you're sort of at home a bit as well here, aren't you?
Oh yeah, that's right.
Great, and you've obviously gone on to do great things, Secretary of the Trades Hall Council, and we're very pleased that you agreed to be our key. I also want to acknowledge some of our local councillors. Councillor Name Kurt, where's Name? I saw a name somewhere. Hi Name. Karen Cherry, and Kerry's up the top there. And I also would like to, there's lots of apologies. I won't go through the apologies list because I actually think we should get stuck into our presentations. But I'd like to acknowledge Jennifer Carnes, who is the ALP pre-selected candidate for the state seat of Melbourne. We're very hopeful at this time where, considering the Greens didn't do so well in the Melbourne mayoral race, that might be a good sign. Can I now find the agenda and the program? Otherwise, Penny, you'll have to come up here and do it. Where are we? Slideshow time. We've put together a series of photographs which we think, Mary Elizabeth and I in my office chose them because we think that it's a good opportunity to put into pictorial context that period in Australian history, which saw Australia's first immigration minister, Arthur Calwell, effectively chart a course for nation building in this country. And here we are some 60 years later, looking back perhaps at that immigration program, which effectively led to the building of contemporary Australia post-Second World War. So we're looking at that period, and there are many people here this evening who would have memories of I've got memories of coming here at the age of 4. It's always fascinating for me to look back and in hindsight and within the context of people like Arthur Calwell, what they're thinking was how they planned and why they made the decisions that they did make. And I think Luke will touch on that as well as will Mary Elizabeth. But this pictorial will give us an indication of the sort of hands-on politician that Arthur Calwell was, the hands-on immigration minister that he was. He made it his purpose to actually get to know the people that he had orchestrated to bring to Australia, and there was a lot going on in a smaller Australia would have had an incredible experience at that time trying to absorb the diversity of the people that were coming here Most of them, of course, were going into work because work opportunities were there. We were nation building, and of course, as we know today, our narrative around jobs, and especially in the newly emerging communities, and here in this electorate, we have received the greatest number of refugees from Syria and Iraq that have come here in the most recent intake in the last couple of years, and certainly in the last 10 to 15 years. And one of the greater issues for those refugees that come here is employment. So a great challenge around employment and the availability of employment and the recognition of their degrees at a time perhaps that's a bit different to Arthur Calwell's Australia. So when we're ready, can we start with the, Mary Elizabeth, I think you need to stand up here because you're going to take us through the slideshow, and there will be a couple of points where Mary Elizabeth will stop just to develop a little bit more of the picture that we're seeing. So can you stand with somebody? Sachi?
Penny, stand.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Penny. Yep. Okay.
I've got the cards, just let me know.
This is a photo of the federal executive of the ALP that agreed to declare war on 3rd September 1939. John Curtin's fourth from the left, my father fifth from the left, and in the front row on the left is Danny McNamara, the federal secretary, and his granddaughter was to be here tonight. She may turn up, I hope so, and that was just of interest too. Oh, that was my brothers and I first visited Parliament House in 1941. It was a family friend of my parents. This was an opening of an old people's home in North Melbourne with my father and brother and a group of pensioners in 1945. My parents were very involved in the Italian community during the war, who had a difficult time because they were on the other side and then they were neutral. And my mother used to receive debutantes, and that's Mrs. Santa Spiritu on her left, and her son may be coming still tonight, Tony Santa Spiritu, who was coming. That's 1946. Now this is 1947, on my parents' visit overseas. They stopped in Darwin, travelling by flying boat, and Baswee was a little boy from Timor who was very grateful to the Australian soldiers during the war. So he hid on the plane, and when it arrived in Darwin, he fell out of the bottom of it. Dad allowed him to stay, and he grew up the administrator sent him to school, and then he grew up and he married a girl from Perth, and he's a grandfather now. This shows you, gives you an indication of the enormity of what was happening in Europe. This is an orphanage in West Berlin where my parents went and wanted to bring children here, but whatever number we selected, an equivalent number would be sent to the USSR, so we couldn't take anybody. This was the first group of Americans that my father and the agent general, Major General Smart, on his left, farewelled in San Francisco, who came here in 1947, and my parents met them again in Sydney when they arrived. Over 1,000 Americans came, but the Matson shipping line decided that there weren't enough people on the return voyages, so it collapsed eventually. But over 1,000 GIs and their Australian wives and families came here. You don't see this as much today. This is the 6-hour march in Sydney in October 1947. My father's second from left, the Premier is fourth from left, and the Federal Speaker fifth from left, marching in through Sydney for a 6-hour day. This is Jeanette Hanlon, a little Scottish girl who arrived in early 1948 as a migrant. And this is a group that came from Egypt on the Mizia, a ship in 1947-48, and my father going them. Now this is interesting because the first group of migrants who came on from displaced persons camp on the General Stuart Heintzelman went to Bongilla, and this lady on the left is training them to be waitresses. And ultimately, the girl on the fourth lady on the left after the teacher became quite prominent in the education department, and the one on the far right became an accountant. This is my father presenting Mr. Chipley with the first Australian citizenship certificate in February 1949. And this is a group of new Australians who were displaced persons at the Bathurst Reception Centre in 1949. And I don't know whether Natalie wants to add anything to the people who were there.
Yes, there are quite a few Ukrainians in that group as well, and some of them are still around and active in Sydney, especially.
And there are Poles and what else?
The girl in this next to your dad.
Yeah.
She's one of the ones that's still around in Sydney.
Oh, right. Yeah. And the man to the left of my father was the man in charge of the camp. So these were Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians. And this is my father teaching him to sing Advance Australia Fair. This is my father welcoming a whole group of people in 1949 at Boangilla Reception Centre. They stayed there for 6 weeks, learned English and the currency, and then were placed in employment. Now here's Isabel. We must find Isabel. She's the 100,000th British migrant.
And Isabel's here this evening. She's been very shy. That koala was given to the Museum of Democracy in Canberra, wasn't it?
At Old Parliament House, yes.
Recently.
Yes. And this is the 50,000th displaced person and her brother, and that was around about the same time. And this is my father addressing people in Newcastle in the 1949 miners' strike. We didn't have TV or PR people. People addressed people in the street or on the back of a truck, and that was a huge meeting. This is a tapestry that the Maronite Christian community from Lebanon did after my brother died. He was 9 there, he died when he was 11, and the nuns in Lebanon made this tapestry from a photo. This is Abla Maroon, who became Abla Ahmad, and she asked my father to give her away at her wedding. And many of you know Abla's restaurant in Carlton, which is quite famous. And this is 70th birthday of Mr. William Liu in 1958 with my father and I. And the couple on the right are the Chinese consul and his wife, and their daughter Brenda is here tonight.
Promised Brenda I wouldn't ask her to speak. Just put your hand up, Brenda.
And this is Mr. Harry Ling and my father celebrating his naturalisation in 1958, and he'd been here for 58 years. And this is the 1958 election day outside the Melbourne Town Hall with Indonesian observers. And there's my father and me and Nora is here.
Where's Nora?
That one?
It's here.
On the right, in front of the sign on the right. Oh, Nora's here.
That's what I'm saying.
This is it doesn't come through clearly, but it's a big page with congratulations in Chinese and English from the Chinese Sydney community when my father became leader of the Labor Party. This was a Jewish function in 1960, and Harold Holt is the fourth on the left, from the left. These are two Aboriginal boys from the Tranby Cooperative in Sydney who were training in trades there. And my father was very close to that group. They're an Anglican organisation. And that's me and the Queen, my father. Lord Delisle was the Governor General. And this is in Beirut, with various groups from the community in 1963, and the man next to my father is from the Gerald Drews. This is with John Kennedy in July 1963, and Howard Beale, ambassadors on the right. And this is a politician from Papua New Guinea in Canberra with my father. He had a lot to do with Papua New Guinea. And this is Baswee when he became a father, and my parents happened to be in Darwin, and then my mother visited his wife, and he was quite pleased. And some of you may know there was an attempted assassination of my father, and he's greeting the Peter Kokan's mother at the court when he was on trial. My parents and me in 1967, and my father was a papal knight at the Vatican, the oath of the Synod of Bishops. And this is my father in 1967 at Australia House in London. And that Dad was nominated by Professor Dick Downing, Professor of Economics, to get an honorary doctorate of laws, and there was a unanimous decision, and Bob Menzies was the Chancellor, and he thought it was a great lot of fun. And this is my father speaking against the Vietnam War when Marshal Key came here in 1968. There were big marches in Melbourne. There were 10,000 in Melbourne and about 10,000 in Sydney, and people in Brisbane and Canberra. But the future leader discouraged people from coming, but they still came, so that was good. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Elizabeth. So I hope that sets the scene. I don't know what they'd all look like in social media today, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. So can I now, it's that time of the evening when we have our keynote speaker to present. So I'd like to ask Luke to step up to the podium, and we're all looking forward to hear what you have to say, Luke. Thank you. There's Father Maher. You finally found your way. We've been communicating for 30 minutes, but he's finally here, which is terrific. Thank you.
Comrades, brothers and sisters, I think we can now declare this as a union meeting, right? Yeah. All right. So this is a union meeting. We're going to start in a union way. So I'm going to say, dare to struggle, and you're going to say, dare to win. And I'm going to say, if you don't fight, you're going to say, you lose. All right. Dare to struggle. Dare to win. You don't fight. You lose. We can do better than that. Dare to struggle. Dare to win. You don't fight. You lose. And did we have a big win today, comrades? Yeah. John and Sean. They were on trumped-up charges. There was a broad conspiracy, everyone from Abbott to Abetz. Usually I get a bit of booing when I hear that. We got Malcolm Turnbull. We've got Cash, we've got Freehills, we've got the ACCC, we've got the ABCC, and all together they came up with these trumped-up charges against two magnificent union leaders who do nothing more than niche it every day, want to make sure that workers come home safely, and to make sure they have good livelihoods as well. And today the court threw out these trumped-up charges. It's a big deal for our movement. There's a lot of celebrating right now at Crown Casino. There's actually dinner there. They're not going for the pokies. There's dinner there. But we're very excited. So yeah, it's a big day for our movement. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of land, Wurundjeri people? Pay our deep respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. This land was stolen. It was never ceded. There is no treaty in place. And some of the good news is that right now there is a treaty negotiation happening right now between Natalie Hutchins, who's the Minister in charge of the State of Victoria, and with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. We stand in solidarity with Aboriginal brothers and sisters, always was and always will be Aboriginal land comrades. I'd also like to acknowledge Mary Elizabeth. Now, Mary Elizabeth would be the closest thing we would have in the Labor Party to royalty. And I say that as a staunch Republican. So I think that's amazing. Also, Maria Van Bakenyu, a terrific local member. I would say a champion for multicultural Australia, and a staunch unionist, and so I'm very proud that Charlotte's there. Jennifer Canis, see you up the back. Now, a little story about Jennifer and I. We were in the North Melbourne branch together for a period of time, and when she won her first by-election, my brother Matthew was running the campaign. So it's just a pleasure to see you in the crowd, like a champion, right up there. Give her a big round of applause. And lastly, to all of you, rank and file, ALP, unionist, through and through, you do the thankless task. You show up to branch meetings, you do the volunteer work that actually makes a difference, that represents the party to all the people in the community. It's a really important job that you get that job done. To the unionists who are here in the room too, who represent our values each and every day, I just want to thank you for that thankless work. It's super important, and I appreciate you all being here to hear me speak tonight. Who here saw 120,000 unionists on the street? Who was at the rally? So if you're all at the rally, I would have said 120,000 people plus another 100. Right, but you're all here. That was a significant moment for our union movement. We haven't seen rallies like that since the Your Rights at Work campaign, really. You know, you think of Fill the G, which we didn't fill. Last week we would have filled the G and Punt Road. There were that many of us out there. I think this is a really exciting time for the Victorian union movement, because you see a new sense of class consciousness starting to develop, because fundamentally working people know that we've got a raw deal. We know that the system has been rigged against working people, and now is our moment to make change. And when 120,000 people hit the streets of Melbourne, you know, that doesn't happen every single day. That's happening because there's a dire need out there. People are crying out to make change. And it's our job as a collective, as a Labor Party, as a union movement, to help bring that change about, because there's a lot going on right now. I think Arthur Calwell would have been pretty rapt at that rally, because I'll talk about him in detail throughout the speech tonight. But there was a woman from Malaysia called Mahani. She got up on stage. You know, I didn't get the biggest round of applause. Sally McManus didn't get the biggest round of applause. There was a Malaysian farm worker who talked about her struggle working with the NUW. I see Ray Gorman in the crowd there, long-time worker with the NUW. You would have been very pleased about that too. But, you know, she spoke about her struggle and what it's like to work in secure work, and the crowd absolutely responded. And it speaks to the generosity and the big heart that we have of our union movement, and a lot of that was because of the work that Arthur Calwell did, and I'll get into that a bit. So let's talk about Arthur Calwell. He will be remembered, and is remembered, as our first and greatest immigration minister. He would have had, at least, and definitely so, the largest impact on what type of country that we've become today, because he had a very strong view about who should be coming to this nation, and he made that happen. Calwell saw the need towards the end of World War II that we need to radically expand Australia's population. I, for one, wouldn't be here without him having this vision. You know, the old catch cry of populate or perish. It was an important decision to make, but to think that he was only thinking about our national security would be wrong, because it was Arthur Calwell who did the negotiations with the International Refugee Organisation to have 12,000 Jewish people who were displaced during the war to come to Australia. I wonder, when it comes to crises like Syria, what type of decision Calwell would have made then, how much more generous Australia would have been, because that decision at the time was not easy. In 1947, there was a poll that put out about, you know, would Australians welcome displaced Jewish people? 58% of the Australian population were opposed to the concept. So that took a type of courage, but a type of courage that we actually don't see every day, you know, definitely from Liberal politicians like Peter Dutton, but sometimes you don't even see it from Labor itself. You know, my mind goes back to incidences like Tampa. You know, what would have been Calwell's response to something like Tampa? Would have you turned those people away on that large boat? I think that the answer to that question would have been definitely no. And he would have shaped the Labor Party for all the better. Calwell refused to back down when we laid out the case for immigration. He persisted despite a fierce campaign that was run not just by the opposition, but also by the press. The newspapers at the time, and this will sound very familiar to all of us, said that migrants were bludgers, they were welfare drains, they were unskilled, they were unfit, and they were dangerous to be part of the Australian community. That is the exact same thing that we hear from conservative media every day. The same story is still being told. That, if we think about this community right now, the anger that people have responded to South Sudanese people, across Victoria is a disgrace. And we needed leaders like Calwell right now to set the record straight. You would remember, I think probably it was just after Christmas time, when the Herald Sun started running those articles day after day, 14 front pages, demonising South Sudanese people. I went down with them to a big community meeting in Kensington. There was about 100 people from different African backgrounds, but largely from South Sudanese. And they were really hurting. I was the only white guy in the room except for a couple of police officers that were invited to the meeting. And they were telling how it was ripping their community apart. To see that every day that their community is being persecuted on the front page of the newspaper, it makes it very hard for their kids to walk up and try to get a job. Because the newspaper has already painted that picture. They know before they walk in the room what's going to be the answer to that, can I please have that job, sir? The answer is going to be no. And it's based on racism as being fueled. So when we think about this next state election, I tell you there's one thing that the Liberal Party of Victoria is going to be campaigning on. It'll be race. It'll be election based on fear, and it'll be the jobs of the Victorian Union Movement, the Labor Party and all our allies to make sure that that is not the narrative. Because we can dream of a much better Australia, just like Calwell did. We're also very proud of Calwell because he was a lifelong unionist, a unionist to the bone. He was the serving secretary of the Victorian State Service Clerical Association, president of the newly amalgamated Australian Public Services Association Clerical Division, and finally was state secretary of the Instrumentalities Unions Committee that saved the arbitration system in 1929. Once in Parliament, he did not stop tirelessly advocating for unions and workers, but he did something else that I think is sort of special too. Him as a leader, he actually helped transform the union movement's view of overseas labour and migrants as well. The White Australia policy, the union movement should own a little bit about this. The union movement didn't want people to, basically taking their jobs. Anyone seen that South Park episode where they talk about taking their jobs? Well, that was a view that the union movement had for a long time. And it took some special leaders, both in our movement and people like Arthur Calwell, to help change that view. And so, I'm personally grateful that happened because, I'd still be in Finland in the bitter cold and the long nights right now. Like all our families and, everyone in this room, and we're a nation of immigrants, apart from our first people, our Aboriginals, brothers and sisters. My family came over here in the 1950s. As noted before, they settled up in West Meadows. That was just vacant farmland. Some of you will remember that. Just farmland. They got a spot. We actually got that house because my grandfather is a notorious gambler. I know we're taping this, so I'm going to be a bit careful. It might not have been the reason we left Finland, but it also might have been. And the state of Queensland. But we got that house because he actually won Tats Lotto, funny enough, in the end, and that paid for a house. Don't worry, it would have all gone back. Don't worry, he was a big gambler. But my grandfather, was working class, didn't speak a bit of English, 5 kids in tow. Grandma didn't speak any English either. He was a cleaner, a miner, a labourer, a gambler, a welder. He was a working class Australian, and he didn't talk much about his union history, and my family didn't so much, but he was a unionist too. But there's a similar story to many other families that are right here today. But that wouldn't have happened without the leadership of Calwell, and can't speak highly for what happened then. That post-World War II migration is the start of what really helped build this nation, and it took that type of special type of leadership. I think of Calwell's moment of political awakening, and Mary Elizabeth was probably quite a many that you could tell us about tonight, but the thing that he wrote about was about his very first meeting at the age of 8. His first meeting at the age of 8 to hear Dr. Maloney speaking about by-elections in the seat of Melbourne, right? There's a bit of a link here.
That's why you're here.
That's why you're here. Yeah, and it makes me think about, well, what was my political moment of awakening too. And does anyone remember a premier called Jeff Kennett? No one? No one? Oh, all right, a few, and it's stuck. It's like action, Jeff Kennett. So I had quite a few. I was a teenager when Jeff Kennett got elected, and there was 3 things that happened pretty quickly for us. My father, he's done a number of jobs like my old man. He was also a welder and a cleaner, but eventually got a good job at the Board of Works. And that was a pretty good job. It's a public sector job until Kennett privatised it all. But he eventually was a welder there and applied for a job at Park Ranger, became a park ranger. But at the time, when you used to have these great state parks, park rangers used to be houses in there. They were caretakers of the property too. Largely it was to lock up the parks and lock up the bins and kick people out who were there very late at night doing, I don't know, you know what they were doing late at night, and to usher them quietly out of the park. So that was one of these things, and Jeff Kennett, for some reason, made a decision to get rid of the Rangers' houses. So we were living in Banksia Park. Has anyone been to Banksia Park before? Or Westerfolds? It was sort of along that Yarra River Trail. And so, that house was knocked down and given to a private art gallery next door, because they said they needed the land. You know what they did with the land? They turned it into a car park. So very quickly after that, a whole lot of park rangers also were made redundant. Old man being one of them. The second thing that happened was I went to a school called Templestowe Tech. Does anyone else have a tech education? Went to a tech school? Great schools. Sorry? Part of the 350, you're dead right. It was part of the 350. So he closed 350 tech and high schools. Well, that happened to my high school. It was merged with the Templestowe High around the corner. Number of job losses, Yep. Broadmeadows Tech, same story. Shut down a number of crucial schools. So, lost my house, and Dad's lost my job at the same time, right? I've now lost what was sort of my school into something that's radically different. And then lastly, I used to spend a bit of time. I was raised a Catholic from that social justice. It wasn't a Jesuit group, but the social justice sort of background. And we used to do respite care for people with really severe disabilities who were in foster homes. Those foster parents, by the way, who take care of really severely disabled children, they're angels, absolute angels. So what we do is we just try to give them a week's holiday, a break, right? And so they can reconnect as a family and just have time to themselves, just to be in the world. And Jeff Kennett shut down the funding to that type of charity. One of many, many charities he shut down. And so as a young man, you sort of think to yourself, I lost the house, schools got merged, my charity just got defunded and we're funding it ourselves now. Well, why is that the case? Then you realise, it was Jeff Kennett. It was politics. Politics mattered. So I did 2 things. I joined the Labor Party and I joined my union. And I'm so proud that I've done it. It's the best decisions I've ever made in my life. And a lot of other people have done exactly the same thing. So what are we as a movement? What is the union? A lot of people have described the union movement as dinosaurs. And I quite like that description of dinosaurs, because dinosaurs have a lot going for them. They're big, they're old, and they eat things, right? I'm obviously eaten a few things. Big. The union movement is 1.5 million members strong. There is no club, no other organisation that has as many members as what we do. And each and every week, union members put money in the can to make sure that their working lives get improved. That's an amazing thing. For election geeks out there, if you want to think of political power, in just about each and every federal seat, there's 10,000 union members. I'll get back to this point a little bit later. Like a dinosaur, we want to eat things. The last thing we ate that was really delicious was the Victorian Liberal government in 2014. That was a big campaign. I touched on that as well. Lastly, we're old. Victorian Trades Hall Council, 1856. It is the oldest still working union building in the world. I see Sonia here, and part of her job is to look after the Trades and Hall Labour Institute, part of the council, to make that happen. The oldest working trades hall in the world. And what we've seen is some amazing things that happened out of that place. Victorian unionists should be very proud. We gave the world probably the greatest gift it's ever received, the 8-hour day. There is no biggest achievement from Victoria than the 8-hour day. The 8-hour day helped usher in the middle class. In April 21st of April 1856, workers at Melbourne University downed tools, and they marched. And they marched down to Swanson and down to Spencer, and they went all the way up to Parliament House, and they said, well, we're not going to stop striking or protesting until we get the 8-hour day. That was such a magnificent achievement, and the fact that it is not celebrated more widely shows how far, conservative governments have changed and moved people's minds. But that is a major contribution to, not just our nation but the world. But there's other things the We Have a Movement have obviously won: the minimum wage, penalty rates, OH&S, paid leave, superannuation, freedom of association, the right to bargain. We've created the weekend. That's an amazing thing. We've created the middle class. Unions have been super important and a fine history here in Victoria. And it makes me think, I wonder what Calwell would think these days about efforts to roll back some of these achievements. Because 120,000 people hit the streets because they think there's something wrong with our system. They think the system is rigged against working people. Inequality in this country is at a 75-year high. It hasn't been this high since the Great Depression. 1% of our richest Australians own 70% of the wealth. That is extreme hoarding. 1% have 70% of the wealth. It's, I think, now widely known that trickle-down economics turned out to be a great big lie. You can work that out. Just look at the name. Just shorten it down. The trickle bit, right at the front. Trick. That's what it was. It was a great big trick. And Australian people have now cottoned onto it. That wealth has never been distributed. It got concentrated in that 1%. More than 700 of our biggest companies pay no tax in this nation. Not a cent of tax. How can that be the case? And yet at the same time, they're asking for an $85 billion handout from the Turnbull government, and they want to give it to them. At some point, we've got to work out that this system has been rigged against working people. This is the same time as they cut our penalty rates last year. So on one hand, we're giving $85 billion to our largest companies who don't want to pay tax, don't pay tax in this nation. And on the other hand, we're going to cut penalty rates for some of our poorest workers. There's something wrong. We have a gender pay gap. How in 2018 do we not have equal pay for women? How is it we have a gender pay gap that's stuck at 15%? That's a national shame. How is that not fixed yet? 40% of Australians are in insecure work. I'm going to spend some time talking about that a bit later as well. But we know that our system of work is also rapidly changing with the gig economy. And you would have seen this online too. But this is not something that we have not faced as a movement before. We have seen adaptation. There's a blueprint for what you need to do. At the advent of the Industrial Revolution, society rapidly changed. Workers moved from the farms, they moved to the city and did that work. They got organised, they were urbanised, they got organised and they got unionised. And when they did it, they were able to make radical change. Well, we need to work out how we do that with the gig economy as well. If you can employ people online on an app, tell you what, I can organise them online on an app. If employing them is cheap to do on the app, well, I can very cheaply do that online too. So the union movement is radically changing how we do our organising. In the next couple of years, you'll see some of that work come out of the Trades Hall Council. But thinking back to that days of Industrial Revolution, the other thing that unions did is we formed the Australian Labor Party. People sometimes forget that. We were the parents. We gave birth to the Australian Labor Party. And sometimes our children wander off and do things we get really disappointed with. It happens. Not Maria, she's fantastic. But others are less fantastic in giving us things like the Fair Work Act. And sometimes that's why we send people, into the corner and we get pretty grumpy and, we try to stop them watching TV or whatever else. But we are the parents. And I think that relationship is super important because there is a battle for the soul of the Australian population right now. On one side, you see the right, and it's a radically changing right. It's a radical right that thinks nostalgically about the days gone past and have added an element of sort of race to it. And then on the left, we see a rising progressive left that has no connection to class. So on this one side, we see the rise of One Nation, of Trump, of Brexit. On the other side, we see a rise of the Greens. And we should be very wary of both things because with no connection to class, to no connection to workers, I think both of those parties will leave us behind. And that's what we think about when we think about the Labor Party and the debates that currently have gone on, and they've gone on for some time. The Labor Party must remain a democratic, socialist party. The Labor Party must be for progressive, the Labor Party must be for secure jobs, it must be for full employment, it must be proudly inclusive and proud to be Australian. We look overseas about what's been achieved by people like Jeremy Corbyn, like Bernie Sanders. We have every hope that Bill Shorten is looking towards these ideas and looking towards these policies and understands that the system is rigged against working people and will be the type of Prime Minister that we need to make happen. But the simple truth is that this party needs to remain a workers' party. Unions and workers is what give this party an identity. Without the Labor Party having unions in it, I don't know what that party is anymore. It would be like Green's Light, like the Pepsi Light of, the Coke Wars. You don't want to go anywhere near it. That would be a lousy party to show up. That's why unions must remain central. It's like the anchor that helps guides its principles. And Arthur Calwell had a lot to say about this. Let me quote. Without the trade union, well, it's not the quote, I'll get to it. Without the trade union movement, the ALP will finish up, and this is the quote now, a muddle-minded, middle-class, petty bourgeois, status-seeking party. I don't think anyone said it better. I think that quote is just as relevant. Now, a petty bourgeois status-seeking party is not a party I want to show up to. But anyway, on Arthur Calwell, I think we can still have much to learn, because if you think of the time he took over the party, it was 5 years after the split. Quite a very difficult time for our movement. And yet, in 1961, when Menzies was on a bit of a roll, under Calwell's leadership, we just fell one seat.
Actually, it was equal with the ACT and Northern Territory Council. And we have over 300,000 more primary votes.
We cheated.
That's the last bit I was going to get to. It is undemocratic because we have the most amount of votes. What an amazing achievement. That is, it's just outstanding. And I don't think people have spoken enough about that or learned the lessons of that. And I was going through some of his speeches just a couple of weeks before it, and it was very interesting because he spoke a lot about the challenges that we also currently face today. He spoke a little bit about automation and the moving around of industry and the international competitiveness. And I think about a seat like, Calwell, I think about Broadmeadows, I think about Ford, and he would have had a lot to say about what happened to Ford, because, we had a Liberal government under Hockey that dared Ford and Holden to leave. You bet they left. They left, and that's had a significant impact on this community, on Geelong, on communities in Adelaide. We're still facing changes when we think of communities in Latrobe Valley, like Morwell, what's happened to those workers at Hazelwood. And finding just transitions for those workers is super important. It's something that we need to think about today. We think about other challenges that Calwell spoke about, and I've got a couple of quotes here. We believe that women should be paid equal with men for work of equal value. Right, he said it right just then, and we still haven't achieved it. We shall intervene before the Industrial Commission to support the ACTU. You don't often hear that come out of the Labor. Anyway, he said it, for immediate restoration of automatically quarterly adjustments of the cost of living. What he's talking about there is automatically making sure that if our wages are falling behind, that he will catch people up. Something that we desperately need to talk about today. Labor recognises the importance of apprenticeships and will do everything possible for an improvement of apprenticeship conditions. Something we're still fighting for today. A lot of apprenticeships are still working in poverty, and people are wondering why you don't want to do an apprenticeship. Well, you don't want to do an apprenticeship because I could just go to Coles and earn twice as much. There was some thinking there today that we can still be inspired by. There's a lot broken in our working system, and I just sort of want to touch on just a couple of things. Just going to check the time here for a minute. I'm getting close. Right now we have 730,000 people unemployed in Australia, 1 million people with not enough hours. That is a major problem, and it affects the working class desperately. We've got some major problems when we think about insecure work, we've got major problems about penalty rates, we've got major problems about wage theft. I want to talk about wage theft very quickly. Who here's watched MasterChef before? I've watched MasterChef, unfortunately. George Columbaris stole $2.3 million from workers. If he had busted through a bank, if he had knocked down that bank wall, got in, got those little bags, put them in his car, buggered off, he would have been in prison right now. But you can steal $2.3 million from workers and nothing will happen to you. Wage theft is a disgusting practice that is now a business model in this country. Last year there was 14,000 complaints to the Fair Work Ombudsman about wage theft. I'm going to do a little poll in the crowd. How many of those do you think were prosecuted? Out of 14,000 was, put your hand up if you think I've hit the right number. So out of 14,000 was 7,000 prosecutions. Okay, no one wants that? 5,000 prosecutions. 2,000 prosecutions. Out of 14,000 did we get 1,000 prosecutions? Did we get 500 prosecutions? A couple of hands at 500. Would we get 250 prosecutions? No, a couple more. All right. 100 prosecutions.
Maybe.
Yeah, all right. I think I'm getting close to half the room now. 50 prosecutions. The real number is 43. 14,000 complaints, 43 people got prosecuted. Now that is 0.3%. So at that moment, that sends a message to every boss around the country. You're never going to get prosecuted for doing it, so why don't you steal your workers' wages? Until a boss gets arrested and locked up, that will never change. The George Columbaris of the world, the Shannon Bennett's of the world. Oh, by the way, George Columbaris, Shannon Bennett, property portfolio, what's that worth? $15 million. You know how they got that? That was off the back of Victorian workers. That's where that money came from. So they made vast sums of wealth by stealing workers' wages. That's a huge problem. So I'm looking very forward to state Labor at some stage making a commitment around wage theft being a crime. Talk very quickly about penalty rates. My first organising job was with the LHMU. Largely look after minimum wage workers. One of my delegates is a woman called Margarita. She's a housekeeper. If you've ever, when you stay in a hotel room, they get 10 to 12 minutes to clean that room. It's not very long, right? Malcolm Turnbull took her penalty rates, right? She is a woman who's just about 60. She's an immigrant woman. She's about this tall. She's got 5 kids, a bunch of kids. It's the second most dangerous industry to work in for injuries because they're mainly women, they're mainly migrants. Try flipping a bed and cleaning a room in 12 minutes and then moving on. To take $4,000 from someone who's earning a little bit over $30,000 a year should be a crime in this country, and that's why the system is broken. We can give $85 billion to business, but take $4,000 from one of my delegates, Margarita, who's a housekeeper. That's appalling. That is a class issue right there. So we want to see that change, and we're very, very pleased that Bill Shorten has made a commitment to legislate penalty rates. That's a great commitment from the party. Last example I want to talk about is Esso. ExxonMobil, the 6th largest company in the world. They pay no tax in Australia, no tax, right? So Esso Longford, there's 230 workers out there. They rock up to work about 330 days ago, and the boss sacked them all, sacked a lot of them. Next day, invited them to a hotel room and said, I want to give you all your jobs back, but you'll take a 30% pay cut. So how they did this is they had subsidiaries of subsidiaries subcontracted to another subsidiary, right? And so over in Perth, they got 5 people together. They did an enterprise bargain with themselves. People who have never worked in Victoria, have never worked at Esso Longford, will never work. They did an enterprise bargain with themselves. So the concept of enterprise bargaining, we're a group of workers, we work at Kangan TAFE, we go to the boss, we negotiate as a group. Well, that didn't happen. 5 people from Perth did that. That's why they've been on the grass for nearly 300 days. So this is happening consistently with very large companies. They're forming their own EBA, they hire some people on their own, they sack the staff and hire people. Now these people have negotiated this enterprise agreement over 20 years. So they've traded things away. That's all gone, and they're still on the grass. One of the key delegates, Troy, very good man, is a really strong family community Christian man. His kids never see him anymore because he's always on the picket line. They say, Dad, can you just spend some time with us and tuck me into bed? But he can't do that because he's doing a political protest on the line every single day. When he told that story to 2,000 union delegates, it wasn't a dry eye in the house. I still get worked up thinking about, that's what his life is. Imagine every day standing on a picket line, not working, just standing there. That is an amazing political protest and something that we need to get fixed. I know I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to wrap up in a tick. Comrades, we've got a massive job to do as a union movement, and the best thing is we are really good at making change. Last time we had rallies like the work choice rallies, we kicked out John Howard and he lost his seat. Right? We know how to do this. In every marginal seat there is 10,000 union members. If I could only speak to every single one of them and talk to them about the stories of Troy's or Margaritas of the world, I know we would switch their votes, and I know we would throw out every single Liberal government. So that's a big job. But we don't do those jobs in isolation. We do this as a collective, as a great collective. And we need the Labor Party to be with the union movement, and when the Labor Party works with the union movement, we are at our very best. There is no change that we can't bring to this world. If we can bring forward the 8-hour day, we can make all those changes to ensure we've got penalty rates, equal weights for women, fair rights to negotiate, that we have the right to strike back, that we have all the powers that we need to make sure that workers are at the centre of this economic system, at the centre of our society, and not on the outside, and that we make sure that big businesses pay their tax. I know as a collective we can get this done, and I'm pretty excited. I think the rest of the people in this room will join us in that challenge. So comrades, dare to struggle. Yeah. If you don't fight, you lose. Thanks very much.
Very inspirational. Now I'm going to ask Mary Elizabeth to step up as well. She has a small presentation, and after that we'll go to questions and answers. So you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, and we'll have an opportunity to get a bit of a dialogue going. So Mary Elizabeth Claw.
But anyway. In July, Maria asked me to speak predominantly about immigration. So this is a summary of Australia at that time and subsequent developments. In July 1945, Australia was preparing for peace with a population of 7.5 million people. Nearly 1 million Australians had served in the Defence Forces in Europe, Asia and the South Pacific, but 39,366 had been killed and many wounded. The depression of the 1930s, when a third of the population was unemployed, resulted in relatively few young people in the population. As Federal Minister for Information, Arthur Calwell was responsible for Radio Australia, that broadcast 18 hours a day to millions of people overseas, and this is during the war, and monitored enemy broadcasts, censorship, propaganda, and he became chairman of the National Film Board and actively promoted Australian culture and identity. He had many friends in several communities from overseas, and the Melbourne Italian community gave a concert in my parents' honour in 1943. Calwell was chairman of the Aliens Classification Review Committee, 1942-1944, that released most detainees and introduced the term refugee alien, political refugees. The Prime Minister John Curtin died on the 5th of July 1945. Calwell, who had promoted immigration, suggested a Department of Immigration with himself as Minister. Chiltley, the new Prime Minister, agreed, and Calwell became the first Australian Minister for Immigration with a department of 24 officers in Melbourne, Canberra and London, who were permanent public servants to the loyal to the elected government. Keynesian economic policies encouraged development and reflected ALP values. I'd just like to digress for 1 minute. On the 14th of February 1945, Dad was at a meeting at the Trades Hall, which he spent a lot of his time at, having meetings, and Joe Bell, who lived in the house, I don't know if you look at the house on the
house is still there.
Yeah.
Matthew Cuggles in there right now. Probably sleeping.
Well, anyway, Joe Bell was there, and he came down. All the phones were in the corridors, and he came down to get Dad, and there was a phone call from Dr. Evans, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, or External Affairs then, to say that the war had ended. And Dad rushed up to the house and met the Bell family. Their daughter was in the army but had to leave to marry, and she was there with her baby and her husband and parents, and Dad picked up the baby and said it was the first baby in Australia to know that the war was over.
I think it was the first broadcast. Actually, that's Trades Hall as well.
He went down to 3KZ and they didn't believe him because the Labor station, which we had then, was in Trades Hall, and eventually he persuaded them to let him tell the world, Australia anyway. And the following morning, Mr. Chifley announced it officially at 9:30 a.m. Anyway, Calwell's first major decision as Immigration Minister was to announce on 24th of July that close relatives of Holocaust survivors could come here, allowing the Jewish community to use departmental offices so that Australia now has the biggest proportion of survivors and descendants outside Israel. In his first policy speech on the 2nd of August 1945, Calwell declared that Australians had learned from the Pacific War that we could not hold this continent unless we increased our numbers. Much of our land is uninhabitable. He emphasised the priorities of defence and full expansion of our economy that required an increased birth rate and planned immigration within existing legislation. The door was open for people from many countries to get their home here within existing legislation. He said policies must lead to greater economic security and a higher standard of living, with continuous employment, housing and amenities to help them fit in with the Australian way of life. Employment depended on production and new markets for Australian products. He stated that it had been proven that maximum effective population absorption capacity in an expanding economy was about 2% of its members, about 140,000 for Australia, leaving a migration ceiling of 70,000 people a year, assuming the economy expanded to take the maximum number. The department would seek advice and assistance from the trade union movement, employer and primary producers organisations. He was holding discussions with the states, religious and social organisations and manufacturers in Britain to move here. In the US, liability for service in the armed forces was by residence and not nationality. Many foreign-born Americans fought to defend Australia, and it was worth exploring this interpretation. He declared, "Unfortunately, campaigns are fostered in this country on racial and religious grounds by persons that have ulterior motives to serve. The activities of such people cannot be too strongly condemned. They make not for national unity and national well-being, but for the creation of discord and bitterness that is harmful to Australia at home and abroad. There must also be a reasonable assurance of a migrant's economic future." He stated, "Any immigration can only succeed when it has behind it the support and goodwill of the Australian people." The priority was to bring Australian troops independence home, and there was a huge shortage of shipping. Many British and Allied ex-servicemen were discharged in Australia, and 200 British tradesmen arrived in January 1947. In 1941, Calwell had protested the treatment of Aborigines and agents who were British subjects in relation to pensions, and the new ALP government extended them to these groups in 1942, while in 1945, unemployment and sickness payments were introduced. In 1946, Calwell introduced legislation that allowed Australian women resident in Australia to retain their nationality after marriage. I don't think people realise that if you married a foreigner, you lost your right to vote and all your legal rights here at that time. Yeah. In March 1947, he proposed that Chinese residents be naturalised, but in the post-war environment, the Cabinet only agreed that regulations be modified and the decision be kept secret. Calwell urged the Liberal Country Party to pass this legislation that was achieved in 1956. The history of immigration has become a maelstrom of myth and misrepresentation. The late Professor Jerzy Zabriskie declared that Calwell was the unacknowledged father of multiculturalism. The term assimilation did not mean rejecting a cultural heritage, but was used as a synonym with integration. Ethnicity and nationality are also confused. Australians have a distinct identity, as do all the nations of the New World, and ours is enhanced by immigration. We cannot be a nation and have ghettos. People have been attracted to this country because of our environment, social achievements, and relatively high standard of living. When some political opponents criticised the appearance of new arrivals, and Calwell said that some of the first group of DPs were fair-haired and blue-eyed like them, that was distorted to assert he only wanted people with their appearance. Migrants were not factory fodder. We had thousands of available jobs, and the people who migrated had often been deprived of an education because of the war. They enjoyed hard-working conditions, and they and their children shared in our prosperity. In 2001, Professor Jeffrey Blaney, wrote that in the political decision that had changed Australia the most was immigration, and Australia's initial task was to sell his bold scheme to the trade unions and the public. He said, he did it with a skill and a zeal that are now overlooked. It is slightly puzzling to observe how the shaper of modern Australia is either belittled or misquoted by people who wear the shoes he made for them and who stand on the space he set aside for them. Blaney told my father in 1972 that more people had come under his skin than any time in our history. In 2009, Bob Hawke stated that the immigration was the most important political decision of the 20th century. And Robert Menzies wrote that only a person extremely popular in the trades halls could have persuaded Australians to accept this immigration scheme. I worked in the Department of Labour and National Service that administered the Commonwealth Employment Service established in 1946, and that the government ratified the relevant ILO convention in 1949. It played a major role in helping migrants. However, John Howard privatised it. In 1974, Gough Whitlam abolished the Immigration Department. I was on the Central Office Committee of my union, the ACOA, that opposed this decision, and immigration was divided between our department, Education, Social Security and Foreign Affairs. Malcolm Fraser reconstituted the department in 1975 with the exception of passports. The second immigration offices in Canberra were in prefabricated huts in Barton. Many years later they were in Belconnen, where the main conference room was named the Calwell Conference Room in 1995 and again in another building in 2011. Now the Immigration Department, that was a major policy department, has been merged with Customs that deals with illegal goods, renamed Border Control, and with several security organisations to become the Department of Foreign Affairs. Immigration is not mentioned among its functions. In 1972, the Good Neighbour Council of the ACT honoured Arthur Calwell, and it was addressed by Bob Armstrong, then Secretary of the Department of Immigration, who had been his secretary. And Bob stated, if Mr. Calwell had been daunted by the problems of those early war years, if he had not been prepared to take calculated risks, if he had not possessed the rare gift of seeing with today the things of tomorrow, many thousands of men and women, their children, and the children of those children would not be enjoying hope-filled lives in this country today. Thank you.
I wouldn't be the member for Calwell today either. I think I should make that point. I also need to put in Jed Carney's, the newly elected member for Batman's apology. Jed's been ill this week, so she wasn't able to join us. So, is Tom here? There's Tom. Are you standing in for Jed? We'll have your understanding. Thank you. We've come to that time of the evening where you get an opportunity to ask some questions. So